Dawkins quotes an article that you wrote in response to this issue, and I suppose I should read what the point that he pulled out, which summarizes this position here. You said, "So whom does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites?
Right.
Not the Canaanite adults, for they were corrupt and deserving of judgment. Not the children, for they inherit eternal life. So who is wronged? Ironically, I think the most difficult part of this whole debate is the apparent wrong done to the Israeli soldiers themselves.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what it would be like to have to break into some house and kill a terrified woman and her children? The brutalizing effect on these Israeli soldiers is disturbing. I must say that the disturbing thing to me there is I can't shake this feeling. And like I say, I have respect for you as a thinker and a philosopher, and I always enjoy our conversations. But hearing somebody talking about the slaughter of admittedly and explicitly innocent children, not to mention animals, as well as the eradication, driving out of an entire society, and to say that, well, the people who really suffered here were the soldiers who had to kill the innocent woman. It just, in a way that like I said at the very beginning of this segment, there's nothing I can do strictly speaking to prove that there's no justification for this. But if there is anything that I've ever heard in my life that jumps out of a page with pure moral repugnance in the way that it meets my ears, it has to be something like that.
Well, I've really thought hard and dispassionately about this, Alex, and I tried to think as hard as I could, who has been wronged in this action? And it's very difficult to think of anyone who has been wronged by God in commanding this. And then it hit me, well, what about the Israeli soldiers themselves? Because we do know from soldiers who suffer from PTSD that the brutalizing effects of war upon soldiers is terrible and can be destructive. And so I explore at some length, what about the wrong done to these soldiers who had to carry out this command? Is there any motivation that might justify giving such a command to them? In the original article, I suggest that yes, indeed, there are goods that would be achieved by having them carry out this command, and that God would have morally sufficient reasons for doing that. That's in my original question of the week, number 16, if people are interested in following it up, where I argue that, in fact, even the soldiers themselves would not be wronged by God issuing such a command. But I was looking for anybody that God had wronged. And, the atheist philosopher, British philosopher Daniel Came, responding to this sort of tiff between Dawkins and me, he said, I think that even though I'm not a Christian, he said Craig's position is entirely reasonable, that the children are not wronged in inheriting eternal life. We're all going to die. Someday many children do die, and God's taking the life of these children prematurely doesn't commit a wrong against them. It's actually, they're good. Now, don't let anybody say, oh, well, then we ought to go kill children. No, that would transgress a divine command against homicide. And therefore, in the absence of a divine command, that would be morally wrong. It is only given this divine command from the paradigm of goodness itself that one would be morally obligated to carry out such a horrific action.
But look, one of the things that Randall Ralston talks about as well is this example of someone who in 2004 committed infanticide, killed her own child.
Yes.
And says that she did so because she believed God was commanding her to. Now, it will be easy enough to just say, I just don't think God was commanding her to. But the question I want to ask is, given everything you've just said, how can we know this? Because generally, if I ask somebody, look, if God told you to shoot up a primary school, would you do it? And what they tend to say is something like, well, I wouldn't believe that was God because that runs against his nature. The problem is that Sure, you might want to say that, just asking a mother to kill her child for no apparent reason might run against God's nature. It just seems to me that intuitively, if we didn't have this story in the Hebrew Bible, if the story of the Canaanites didn't exist, and we were speaking in the hypothetical, and I said, well, what if God told you to, I don't know, walk into somebody's land and not just drive them out, but if they refuse to go, to kill them and then come back and kill the women and kill the children, and in fact kill the animals too. And if they leave the animals, they get punished for not killing the animals as well. What if he told you to do something like that? And I imagine the only thing somebody would be able to say is that, well, of course God wouldn't tell me to do that. And that's how I know that I wouldn't want to follow that command. But that's exactly what's happening here. So it leads us to a radical moral skepticism, in other words, is Rausser's critique.
Oh, I don't think it does that. But notice what you're raising here now is an epistemological question, not a metaethical question. This is now no longer a question about whether or not it would be right or even obligatory to carry out such a command. The question now you're raising is an epistemic question about how could I be sure that God has in fact issued such a command. And in the case that you mentioned of Andrea Yates, this was a severely mentally disturbed woman who was hearing voices and was schizophrenic. And it might well be the case that epistemically, Alex, that no one would be justified today in thinking that God had issued such a command. It would be plausible to think that they ought to conclude that in fact they're hallucinatory or schizophrenic or mentally ill and go see a counselor. But that's an epistemic question about how did God communicate his revelation to Joshua and these Old Testament Israelites in such a self-authenticating way that there was no doubt that this was being commanded to them.
It is an epistemic question.
Sui generis.
It is an epistemic question here, but I suppose what I'm pointing out is an implication of this view, which is that at the very least, if I were to hear a very convincing voice tonight telling me to go and murder children in a primary school tomorrow, and I fully believed it was the voice of God when I woke up and I couldn't shake it, I could say, look, maybe I should go and get tested I feel fine, I feel rational, I seem rational, maybe I should go and see if there's something wrong with my brain. But the one thing I can no longer do, I think, is say something like, I know I must be going crazy because God would never tell me to do something like that. I'd have to at least consider the possibility that God actually is telling me to go and do something like that, because there are instances in the Hebrew Bible where God does tell people to go and kill innocent children, and you would say justifiably so. So I'm removed of that ability to know for sure that I'm deluded.
Yes. Well, it's true that it would be possible, but as I say, there's nothing in the argument for the consistency of these propositions that would imply that anyone would ever be justified in believing that they had received such a command, because it would go against what our normal objective moral duties are. As you say, we have strong moral intuitions that taking innocent life is morally wrong. And so for us to believe that God is commanding us to do that would require just incredible, overwhelming justification. And it may well be the case that nobody today would have such a thing. That's just, I'm not interested in defending that epistemic question.
Just to be clear, where you said there, it's possible, you mean it is possible, even if, as you say, the epistemic question is a separate thing, whether we could know this is the case, it is possible that God could command something so intuitively immoral as walking into a primary school and shooting it up or something. It's possible that he could command such a thing.
Well,
it would be consistent with his nature, in other words.
Yeah, is it possible? That one seems to me to be plausibly contrary to his moral nature. But it is possible for God to issue commands that would override what our moral duties are. So,
sure.
Yeah, I would say that it is possible, but that's not to say that anyone would ever be justified in believing it.
To watch the full conversation, click the link that's on your screen. Subscribe to my main channel or this Clips channel by clicking just below it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.